Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. This panel is held in honor of 2021 Domestic Violence Awareness Month. My name is Yan Ma. I'm the VAWA project coordinator at Southwestern College. VAWA being the Violence Against Women Act. As you may know, Southwestern College leads a consortium of San Diego area institutions and organizations as part of our VAWA grant effort. This VAWA grant allows our consortium to focus our attention on informing our communities about the issues underlying violence against women. That includes, but not limited to, domestic violence, sexual assaults, and sexual harassment. The speakers for this panel are Mr. Bruce Eaton and Ms. Analicia McKee-Chau. Mr. Eaton is a survivor of male rape and hate crime. He's currently employed at Southwestern College, assisting veterans with their certifications. He has a master's in business administration. He worked for your emergency service for 6 months in Minneapolis, Minnesota, as phone counselor to assist those needing someone to talk to. He worked for the Gay and Lesbian Hotline in Minneapolis for 1 year. He volunteered for 9 years, training volunteers for the Lesbian and Gay Men Center hotline in San Diego, where he co-created a training manual, trained over 500 individuals to answer crisis and information calls. He ran a hate crime support group at the LGBTQ Center for 4 months. He worked for California Center on Victimology for 2 years, attended 2 national organization victim assistance conferences, where he spoke once on homophobia and another time on hate crimes. He volunteered at Center for Women's Studies, speaking to groups of individuals, sharing his survivor stories throughout Southern California. Ms. Analicia McKee-Chau is a Shelter and Supportive Services Director at the South Bay Community Services, SBCS, where she has worked for 8 years. Analicia directly oversees the agency's domestic violence programming, which includes a confidential domestic violence shelter, transitional housing, and rapid rehousing programs, as well as the agency's 24/7 domestic violence response team, victim advocate team, and counseling services for victims. Analicia is an active member of the San Diego Domestic Violence Council and sits on their executive committee and steering committee. She has been part of the San Isidro Domestic Violence Prevention Collaborative for 2 years and enjoys seeing the impact the prevention work has had on the San Isidro community. Analicia graduated with an MS in mental health counseling and has experience in direct service, program management, and facilitation of individual and group therapy with survivors of domestic violence. In this panel, Mr. Eaton will share his personal story concerning male rape and male crime. Then Ms. McKee-Chau will provide data and information on prevention and survivorship concerning the issue of domestic violence. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Mr. Bruce Eaton.
Hi, everyone. Okay, so I just go. It's been a while since I've talked about this, just a few weeks. The male rape occurred because I was trying to be somebody I wasn't. I was out with a friend who had a very easy time at talking with people and meeting other people. And I found myself wishing I was that kind of a person. So one night while we were out, and within, I swear, 10 minutes, he met somebody and started talking away and probably went home with them. I decided to try the same. And I found someone drunk. And even the time while he was following me in his car and I was in my car, I kept thinking in my head that this wasn't me. This wasn't something I do. I don't go home with strangers. I don't bring strangers home. But there was a voice in the back of my head that kept saying, well, you did invite him over, you have to follow through. every moment from there to the door, even when we got inside, I offered him a drink, thinking, oh, maybe he'll have a drink and he'll pass out and that'll be that. But that wasn't the case. Two things that got me through that night. One was that I do remember that I said no, that I did verbally try to prevent it from happening. The second thing was I just stared at the clock and just watched the minutes go by. And I just sort of removed myself from the situation. And in the back of my mind, there was a voice saying, this is what you deserve. This is what you asked for. The weekend sort of changed everything in my life. I had a friend who was very much in love with me, but I thought he was just a nice guy. And before the weekend was over, I committed to a relationship with him, simply because he was somebody I knew before this happened, and therefore he was safe, and therefore this wouldn't happen to me again if I was in a relationship, regardless of how I felt. Another benefit of that weekend is I stood up a friend of mine on Sunday, and she committed suicide. I found out on Monday. So I had a lot of guilt. Luckily, by committing myself to a relationship, I could say, well, we can't engage in any sexual activity until we've both been tested. So I allowed myself a break period. I really developed two minds. There was a part of me that was dealing with it, and the other part of me that was just denying the existence of me. I really felt like I was two separate people, and that continued for quite a while. And in some respects, I just blocked the entire incident from happening to me until the hate crime happened. The hate crime sort of became a bookend to the relationships. At that time, I was living with the person I'd met before. His name was Todd, and we lived not in like a Hillcrest territory, but like adjacent to it, which I guess like University Heights. I met two friends, and we decided we were going to go to the bar, and I left a message for my boyfriend that when he returned, he could come pick us up and join us. He had the car that night. His car had been broken, so we met at a bus stop. The friend came who they targeted. 3 gentlemen with us, and at that moment, only one of us smoking. Alex, she was, and they asked for a cigarette, and she said no. And then his two friends stood up closer, so we took our steps forward to say, you know, don't do that little point. Hopefully I'm still connected. I guess I'm getting this weird sound. We weren't aware of, even though it was a light intersection with lights, it was in front of a restaurant. There was a bus stop with 9 people coming in and out of the restaurant, coming out of cars that we were in front of. What we weren't aware of was there was about 5 or 6 of them standing behind us. Lead pipe came and hit me in the back of the head, and that's the last I remember. I was later told a lot of details. I found out if I got my friend Alex drunk, she would reveal things to me about what happened, about conversations I had, things that were asked, a lot of very descriptive things. One of the things that happened was the paramedics told, when they finally arrived, they told Mark that I would probably not make it to the hospital. Alex had her own trauma of trying to get help. She ran to a small 7-Eleven type store, and the clerk there would not let her use the phone. And she jumped up on the counter and demanded it. When I ended up in the hospital, they just said, the only thing I do remember was them asking that they thought it'd be a good idea if they called my parents. And I said, why? And then they said it again, so I said, okay. It took about 8 months for my face to get put back together. At that point, I feel myself very fortunate that my jaw had been broken, and they told me, well, in order, if you drink or something, you might throw up, and you'll need these wire clippers, and you have to click and break it in 4 places, or you'll choke to death. So that prevented me from drinking for quite a long period. When I finally did have them removed, the thought of going outside was beyond me. I went through every symptom of post-traumatic stress. When I finally got into therapy for it, that is when the rape finally came out, and that became more of the issue to deal with. My parents laid a very heavy guilt trip on Todd. because he had the car, and this would have happened to me if I'd been in a car rather than at a bus stop. All the people at the bus stops swore they saw nothing. Found out later, I was the middle of 3 people. The third one, they broke both of his arms and lit him on fire. We fit the description of what a gay person looked like, even though I don't really consider that the gay neighborhood, but regardless, that's what it was. My life definitely changed. And even to this day, I will wear tennis shoes anywhere I go. I pay attention to everything around me. I will always go someplace early and usually leave early. And I will rarely go alone if I can prevent it. And those are things that stick with you. The rape was probably the hardest thing to get over, honestly, because there was listening to your own self and admitting that that I may have that no means no, and I didn't ask for it. And it was hard because there's so much a part of me that was saying that I deserved it because I asked for it. And so it was very hard to deal with. And here I am today, doing well. I think that's it. And questions afterwards, but that's pretty much everything.
Bruce, thank you so much for sharing your story. And yeah, I'm so touched by your experience and also your courage. Thank you so much. And we'll open up a question after Analicia gave us a presentation. Yeah. If you want to ask the question, you can also leave us a message via chat box, or we can just you can just ask our speakers directly later. Okay. Yeah. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Ms. Analicia McKee-Chau.
Thank you, Yan, and just want to echo what you said. Thank you so much, Bruce, for sharing your story. It definitely takes a lot of courage to be vulnerable and, resurface all of those memories. So thank you. Typically, my presentations, as Yan mentioned earlier, my focus is with domestic violence. Today's presentation will focus more on sexual assault. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and I'll just ask for confirmation that you can all see that. Can you see my screen? Okay. All right. So just hearing from Bruce and you sharing your story, a lot of the things that you mentioned resonate as commonalities across sexual assault and the experience that many people share. So obviously you saying no, and no means no. That is, what we hear a lot of in the media when people are discussing consent. Behind that being the self-blame as a result of thinking, well, maybe what did I do to cause this? I must have done something and asked for it because I invited him over. And then I heard a bit of like a dissociation when you mentioned like just watching the clock and the time tick by. And then the PTSD being a common factor after somebody experiences this type of assault. So these are all things that I'm going to touch on in my presentation. So just a 101 of sexual assault, because there's misconceptions of what does that entail. Is it only rape? And no, it can encompass a lot of different types of sexual contact. So you can see, yes, rape is one type of sexual assault, but it also includes anything that is unwanted in sexual contact. So that can include sexual harassment, exploitation and trafficking, masturbation in public, and any non-consensual sex that is due to fear or intimidation. And of course, as we heard from Bruce, there are things that the survivor experiences as a result. It's different case by case, and it can happen right away, or it can happen much later after the fact once a survivor has processed what they experienced. So feelings of shame and doubt, very common. And it sounded like, Bruce, you mentioned a bit of that, like kind of doubting, is this me? That, I'm doing things that are kind of outside the norm, but also, doubting, did this really happen because I invited this person into my life? Mental health challenges that come up are not just isolated to PTSD. There's other factors can include depression, suicidal ideations or attempts, and then problems with future relationships. So if you've been violated and you have stood up for yourself and that was not respected, in future relationships, it can be really challenging to have intimacy and feel comfortable, like your rights are going to be respected, and being vulnerable again. There's a lot of fear tied to putting yourself in that space once again, and what could happen, if it happened once, and maybe I did something to provoke this, then what if I do that again? What if it happens again? So that can lead to avoidance, and that avoidance can be of people. It can be, self-isolation, just really removing yourself from any type of a situation or environment that can potentially cause this to happen again, or avoiding certain places, certain groups of people. And then the self-blame is a common experience. I know it's common to hear in the media when we hear of female victims of sexual assault, there's a lot of victim blaming that happens, right? People ask the questions, well, what was she wearing? Or why was she walking alone late at night? And already that flips the script to take the blame off of the perpetrator and start questioning the victim. And, that's just so unfortunate that that's how the narrative is heard so often. So of course, with those questions coming up, you can imagine why a survivor would start to then think of those things. And well, I was out late at night and I was, maybe a little tipsy, or I was wearing, XYZ. So maybe I did provoke this behavior, but we know that that's not accurate. We know that the blame should be on the perpetrator. And of course, there's long-term effects. Being a survivor of sexual assault can increase certain behaviors. It can increase drug use. It can increase issues with school or work, or withdrawing, like I mentioned, isolating themselves from groups of families or family or friends. And then it can pose an increased risk with certain mental health experiences. So this doesn't happen to every survivor, but it does increase the possibility of these risk factors. So additionally, for women, the higher risk of pregnancy, if this was an unwanted sexual intercourse and there was no protection, then increased risk of pregnancy, and also STDs with men and women. STIs, sorry, that is a new way to say it, right? So there's a lot of reasons why we know sexual assault in all of its different forms can go unreported. We talked about the blame, but there's also a fear of not being believed. And I think a lot of what we hear in the media of, really powerful people who maybe abuse that power, that intimidation can be used as a tactic to lead the victims to say, well, how can I compete with that, right? This person is so powerful, or this person is so well known, nobody's ever going to believe me. Retaliation, depending on who the perpetrator is, if it's, somebody close to them, which a lot of times it is someone in their circle, that could be a reason for not reporting. And then fears of shame, fears of being blamed, pressure from others. If this is someone who is in a circle of friends or is, a family friend or from work, and others may know about what happened, there could be pressure to say, hey, like, really don't say anything. It wasn't a big deal, or they didn't mean it, or think of how you're going to ruin their life if you bring this up. So that can really flip somebody's thought process of the repercussions and almost protecting the attacker. And then, of course, we have, recently with everything going on in 2020, there's a major distrust of law enforcement. So really, that goes hand in hand with not being believed. So specific to the LGBT community, there is a misconception that domestic violence and sexual assault are really just a heterosexual experience. And that is a major misconception. Domestic violence, sexual assault happens just as frequently in same-sex relationships as heterosexual. And a lot of the data shows that it's actually often more violent in same-sex relationships. And there are, unique issues that are faced by the LGBT community. And I'm going to go a little bit more into detail on female to female and male to male. But one of those things is, if the person, the victim of the assault has not come out about their sexual orientation, there is an additional fear that could be in the mix of not reporting, which is being outed. If the community, the LGBT community where they reside is very small, there could be fear, oh, they're going to take sides. They're going to believe the perpetrator. Nobody's going to believe me. Or then if I do come out and say something, I'm going to lose my whole circle of support, my whole circle of friends, my community. So finally, one more reason someone in the LGBT community may not report is, the self-blame and guilt that we discussed earlier, but that could lead to questioning their sexual identity and their sexuality. Am I really attracted to this person, this sex, or, questioning whether that that is the type of relationship that they choose, that they really want to be in. Again, the fears of reporting coincide and really reflect similarly to the heterosexual with regards to being ignored or accused of making things up, not being believed. But what is noted with same-sex relationships is the need to explain in more detail than an assault that would have happened in a heterosexual assault. So I think because there's this, potential extra curiosity or extra kind of questioning that can happen because of the disbelief that this doesn't happen in the LGBT community, people involved on the back end of the investigations, whether that's law enforcement or even those in social services, potentially unknowingly do more digging, which can, we know, be traumatizing to the survivor. And so it is reported that a lot of times they're asked to describe in further detail than maybe someone of a heterosexual assault would have been asked to do. For male to male assault, there is the perception that, men are always the perpetrator. So in female to female assault, there's a lot of questioning or confusion as to, well, women don't do that, right? Women cannot be abusers. And we know that that's not true. And that it doesn't just apply to same-sex relationships, that can apply to heterosexual relationships where we do know that women can be domestic violence perpetrators as well. There is still stigma related to the LGBT community. And so that can, people having these internal biases that come out in their work, whether that's coming from law enforcement or social services, all the different agencies that one might touch when they come out and ask for help. Those service providers may unknowingly or even intentionally treat certain survivors in a homophobic manner. And additionally, there is the myth that the larger person in the relationship is stronger, and so that must mean that they're the batterer. And we know that that's not true. This is a lot about power and control, and that power and control is seen through a variety of tactics. There's manipulation. It's not all physical. That is something I definitely wanted to point out. So here we're going to focus on the female to female sexual assault, and these are common myths. Like I mentioned earlier, there is the myth that, women cannot be sexual predators, and it's not true. Women are just as capable of using power and control to manipulate situations. There's the misconception that we are, as women, maybe timid or weaker in stature, and that coincides with the belief that all that's needed is like a physical overpowering of someone to assault them, and that's not accurate. Women are capable of sexual exploitation, and yes, because society portrays women as being stereotypically safe and nurturing and caring in nature, that coincides with the belief that this just can't happen, that women could be perpetrators. Another myth that lesbians are sexually attracted to all women. Lesbians are butch and therefore must behave like men. And also that the partner in a female and female to female relationship is that whoever is more butch or physically larger must be the one who is the abuser. So again, these are myths for female to female. Until recently, there really haven't been a lot of positive lesbian role models in popular culture. So if you can think of, media, whether that's television, movies, social media, little by little, we're seeing more of this progressive nature where it's more inclusive, but the gay narrative does still tend to focus on men. So other stats with the female to female is that women do rape other women, and rape does not need to be perpetrated by a man. Rape can occur with the use of objects. And so that's a common misconception that, rape is only through penetration from male to male or male to a woman with the use of their penis. And that is not accurate. There is because of these societal beliefs that we hold commonly, this can be to the advantage of a female perpetrator. So, people may be less inclined to see a female perpetrator as, an abuser. So therefore, they're easily left to move on to another victim because, well, no, if their victim comes forward and says, she did this to me, no, that's not possible. Women don't do that. And then that perpetrator can move on to the next relationship and the next. Sorry, I say relationship. I really just should say woman because you don't need to be in a relationship, right, to have the assault. So women in same-sex relationships may be reluctant to label other women as abusers and involve police. We know that there's a lot of stigmas tied to the LGBT community. Again, it goes to that protecting of the perpetrator. Again, issues with self-blame and feeling, like I just said, compelled to protect. As I mentioned earlier, that, typically what we see in the gay scene in the media, portrayed in movies, is still centered mostly with males. So we do know that LGBT community continues to be ostracized from the community at large, and there is still internalized homophobia within people who identify in the community, but also homophobia within the general public. Transphobia and sexism can also be part of this, this dynamic, and all of these things can lead to someone having lower self-esteem and then increasing the self-blame. So social isolation can be perpetuated and exacerbated if somebody is living in a rural community. You know, we think we're here in San Diego, so, you know, most people come to mind Hillcrest, right? And that's more urban, and we think of San Diego as a very large community. But if somebody's living out in, you know, even part of San Diego, let's say Ramona, you know, potentially not having a robust LGBT community that they are a part of, that can lead to further isolation. Like I mentioned earlier, threats of outing someone who has not come out yet. And there is a struggle to describe non-consensual sex between women. You know, with male to male, we think about somebody's physical body, and what is the assumption is that, oh, well, he had an erection, so therefore he must have wanted it, and therefore that means consent, right? And with women, we don't have that physical indicator that people can turn to kind of say, oh, you know, it was or was not consensual. And so people can struggle, women may struggle to describe, you know, what is consensual and not consensual between two women. So moving on, I don't know if there's any questions, but I know, Yam, that you wanted to leave them till the end, but I'm sure this brings up questions for people. So moving on to male sexual assault, you can see here from the infographic that males in the 18 to 24 age range are 5 times more likely than non-students of the same age to be victim of rape or sexual assault. So, you know, potentially the college environment, which what do we know of that can happen a lot of times, is drinking. But then that goes to, you know, well, what was the cause, right? Was it, oh, somebody drank and so that's the reason they got raped? Well, no, we know that's not the case. There are millions of men in the US who are victims of rape. The statistics show that approximately 1 in 33 have experienced attempted or completed rape. And as we know, perpetrators can be any gender, any sexual orientation, and any age. If you think about, oh, his name is not coming to mind, but the mogul in Hollywood, who's an elderly gentleman who was accused of sexually assaulting multiple women, you know, people might think, but he's older, you know, he's walking with a cane, you know, which is obviously to portray him as, you know, he can't be someone who does that because he's, you know, physically limited, which we know is not true. So it can run the gamut of the age spectrum. But being a victim of sexual assault as a male can lead to feelings of feeling like less of a man. And also the similar reactions that I mentioned earlier in victims who are heterosexual. I thought this infographic was important to share. It shows the time frame that it takes for male and this male sexual assault victims to come out and share what happened. You know, Bruce, I don't know where you fall in on this graphic, but it's very telling, right? That if you look at the majority, 41% still have never spoken about it. You know, there's a lot of shame, a lot of misunderstanding that goes into sexual assault in general. And then once you kind of chip away at what we view as normal sexual assault and you hone in on smaller demographics, it's less and less shared and less believed. So here are some additional myths regarding male-to-male sexual assault. You're a man, you should be able to fend him off. Gay men are all predatory. Naturally, men are promiscuous and therefore they must be attracted to all men, same as the female to female. Gay men do not have long-term loving relationships and the sex must always be penetrative in nature. And again, that belief that men cannot be victims. They're always the perpetrators. And like I mentioned earlier with physical anatomy, people, that common belief that, well, he had an erection, he must have wanted it. Tied in with, well, that must mean consent, right? All men are physically strong and would not allow consensual sex. So if they didn't fight someone off, then that must have been the consent there and they must have wanted it. And then being assaulted, so maybe a male who was assaulted, now he must be gay. So again, these are all myths. There can be situations of internalized homophobia or transphobia, often a result of low self-esteem, but this can continue with that narrative of self-blame, feeling like they don't deserve better afterwards or even beforehand, you know, or to kind of validate what happened to them or justify what happened to them. Well, I must have deserved it. And then that reluctancy to report. So there's different environments where gay men may meet to socialize. These are just some examples, and in these environments, this is just to show you how, because of these environments, it can sometimes perpetuate or lead to higher risk of sexual assault. So I'll start kind of at the bottom, the chemsex parties where people at the parties are under the influence. So these parties have shown to lead to increased reports of rape. Online apps, which are common in heterosexual relationships as well, but online apps specific for the gay community. If someone who is a perpetrator and knows what they're doing and is using the app as a form of manipulation, they may invite the person that they're communicating with through this app to meet them in a location that they're familiar with, but know that their potential victim is not, and just using that as a form of power and control in that dynamic. Dark rooms in some bars or clubs can lead to anonymous sexual activity, and identifying who assaulted the person may be difficult. And then finally, cruising sites, which are kind of like moving sex workers, reporting sexual assault is low in that situation. Newer people to the gay community, and like I mentioned, in smaller communities, feeling isolation and having difficulty reporting. But factors that lead to that power dynamic, not just the physical, right, but other factors that can contribute to an inequality of power can be differences in social class, differences in race and ethnicity, disability status, faith, and wealth. So if we think about somebody with a lot of money, you know, abusing what that can mean, or using what that can mean and abusing people who don't have that access to money, using that as a form of power and control over their victims. And that's something that I think we hear of and kind of comes to mind when we think of more of the famous sexual assault cases that we hear from Hollywood, for example. All right. Majority of sexual assault victims are found to be under the age of 30, and with the majority of them still being women. But I think this is important to note that if you look at 43% of men, that's almost half of all men who have been assaulted in some kind of way. Often the perpetration is happening by somebody who is either a current intimate partner or a close friend. So, you know, you think of child abuse and the grooming that can happen, right? Or sexual abuse of children. This reminds me of that, in that somebody who is either in a relationship with you or is a close friend may have this feeling like, well, you know, we're close, so they're not going to report me. And feeling a sense of protection through that. I'm not going to read through all of these, but if anyone who's here is interested in just taking a photo of this, you're welcome to. These are just some startling statistics on sexual assault. You know, the cost to our community and the mental health cost, the impact, the long-term impact that victims have as a result of being a victim of sexual assault is huge. So I'll just leave this here for a couple more seconds. And here are some resources. There's a hotline as well as a couple of organizations here in San Diego that do have access to advocacy for victims of sexual assault. And that is it. If anybody knows someone who needs help or personally needs help, again, like I mentioned, we do have a lot of our focus is on domestic violence. We are available for people who need to reach out and get connected to support as a victim of sexual assault. So here's my contact info and my program coordinator, Marcy, who's not here today, but she's available as well.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Analicia, for sharing your wonderful thoughts and information with us. And I really like your presentation. It's very, very informing. Thank you. Are there any questions from the audience members? I have a question for both Bruce and Analicia. Bruce, I know right now you're in the place of survivorship, right? So what helped you to reach survivorship, like change from a victim to survivor? And Analicia, if you can also respond to this question, like how to help a victim to reach to survivorship, that would be great. Thank you both.
Yeah. I would say if it wasn't for, it's a sad thing to say, but it wasn't for the hate crime, I never would have ever addressed it or told a single person. But it did have, and it still does, long range effects to me, which is a lot what Analicia was writing. I was reading that and I was getting kind of emotional about it because it's all very true. And now I forgot the question. What was the question again, please? Sorry.
Yeah. So my question is, what helps you to like change from a victim to a survivor?
I would say the therapy. The therapy helped me a lot because one of the first things he said was that, you know, you're not alone and it's not your fault. And a lot of things that, you know, and explaining post-traumatic stress and everything to me, I felt very isolated and very alone, that this was just me experiencing all of this, and that I was going crazy. I was going insane. So for me, talking to the therapist and then being open and honest with other people and sharing it, it greatly helped.
Yeah, I thought to kind of revisit that slide, Bruce, of the visual that shows, you know, how long on average it takes men to share, you know, their trauma. And I saw you nodding your head. So it sounds like, you know, if it wasn't for this, the second crime you were a victim of, that you may have still kept it with you.
Mhm.
And just to echo what Bruce said, yeah, and I would say, you know, from moving from victim to survivor, you know, with sexual assault, with domestic violence, it really takes that processing time. It takes time and it takes processing what they went through. And a lot of times what's most beneficial is going to be that professional help through therapy, and really, you know, putting yourself to be vulnerable, but talking with a professional who can be very validating of all the feelings that surface when talking about this. It validates, you know, that this was not your fault, that this happened to you, that these feelings are normal and common. I think you hear, if I'm thinking of that gynecologist who was seeing all of those gymnasts, and it came out, and they all, you know, until it started to become more public that this was a trend of his, you know, you can imagine that a lot of them were internalizing what happened and questioning, well, did I make that up? Am I imagining? Did that really happen? What did I do to kind of lead him to believe that that was okay to do? And of course they were young, right? So even more adding to that dynamic of power and control. And once they saw that there was this trend, then that can be validating in itself too. And so Bruce, you know, working with a therapist, hearing that, you know, you're not the only person who has unfortunately had this experience, can really lift that feeling of being alone.
Thank you both. Thank you so much.
I did want to add one thing to what you said, Analicia. I've always thought in the back of my mind that the reason, and it was really good to see the statistics of it, that male to male rape and female to female rape is so much higher. And I do understand the underreported part, but I also feel it's higher because maybe we're brought up for, you know, men are brought up, you don't hit women. So without the dynamic of a man to woman relationship, you don't have that conflict to hit another person. You know, so I shouldn't hit a woman, but I can hit a man. This woman can hit a woman because that's different than a man hitting a woman. So part of me always felt that it's very underreported that the LGBTQ probably have a higher percentage, which you gave a lot of information for. So thank you for that.
That's a really interesting point.
Mm-hmm. So are there any suggestions like from both of you, for the potential victims, especially for those from LGBTQ community? Like how to help prevent to be a victim of domestic violence or sexual assault within LGBTQ community?
Part of me, like for me, I wish I'd listened to the voice that said that this wasn't me and that I did not need to do anything, that I needed to leave the situation. You know, I had plenty of opportunity in so many different places to have not had that happen. But the voice, and I just kept listening to the voice that said, well, you know, you agreed to this, you said yes, and so on and so forth. So I really do think it would have helped me, and maybe it helps others, if you listen to that voice inside your head that's saying, this is not a good situation, you know? And then talk to people too. You know?
I see.
Yeah, I want to avoid kind of saying, oh, you know, don't put yourself in, like, don't get too drunk or don't wear certain things, because then again, that adds to the narrative that it's the victim's fault, right, that this happened. So for me, I think prevention looks at conversations from a very young age of what is okay, what is consent, and what are healthy relationships? What does that look like? You know, I think a lot of that with domestic violence is kind of coming up right now and is becoming, there's a lot more funding looking at prevention versus intervention, which I think is really important. And the more that we can have those conversations from a younger age, and that ties into sexual assault too, like what is healthy, because we know sexual assault can happen in your own relationship. And I think that's a huge misconception, that it needed to be a stranger or somebody I wasn't in a relationship with to be considered sexual assault. And that's just not accurate. So continuing to emphasize what does a healthy relationship look like, and what to do, what are some of the red flags to look out for, and what to do, who to reach out to if you're feeling like you need help leaving an unhealthy situation. That's what I would add to that.
Thank you, Analicia. Okay, any other questions from our audience members?
I'll add a little more before the question. One of the reasons that going to the other hate crime, I like to share it because it breaks the stereotype that the hate crime happens in a dark alley and I'm all by myself. This happened with 8 people in front of the restaurant, lights, cars everywhere. It was a very busy intersection, a restaurant there. I mean, there was people everywhere. So that's one of the reasons I like sharing it, because everybody thinks, oh, you know, you should have been down that alley. You should have been all by yourself here. So it helps break down the stereotype that it can happen anywhere. And same with domestic violence and all this. And that's all.
Thank you, Bruce. Okay.
Yeah, I have a question for both Analicia and Bruce. So what do you know, for an office like ours, Office of Employee Relations in Title IX, where we handle you know, complaints of a Title IX nature that includes concerns of domestic violence, sexual assault, what do you think we should know when we hear from, you know, individuals of this community with those concerns? What are maybe some pieces of advice that you could give us as practitioners, I guess?
I can jump in. I would start with believing the victim. Your response is gonna either make or break them feeling like you're a safe person to open up to. So really being cautious and careful with the follow-up questions that you may have, and really knowing your role in that, because are you asking questions just out of your own curiosity or out of an actual need to know this information? Is that really law enforcement's role? Because we know that the more times a victim has to repeat their story, that's more traumatizing. And if they really don't need to tell you that information, then you shouldn't be asking. If it's not pertinent to your job, then it's more so your personal curiosity. So I know it can be really intriguing sometimes, like, oh my gosh, you know, this is so concerning. Like, tell me more. What happened? And wanting to know the details. I think that's like our natural, as humans, kind of having that natural curiosity, but it's really not appropriate if it's not part of your role. So believing the victim and just being very cautious with responses, and then knowing already where to do the warm handoff, because a lot of times victims just spend time calling one place to another. So if you can be supportive in sitting with them to make that call, if that's what they need, and asking what do they want, because if they don't want that, then respecting that too. So really asking permission at every step as far as how do they need support.
Nothing to add to that. That's excellent. Everything that Analicia just said was perfect. I totally agree.
Okay. So if you don't have any questions, then that's our panel. And thank you so much. Thank you, Ruth and Analicia.
I think Will had a question that he entered into the chat.
Will has a question. Question for Bruce. Can you share who was the first individual that you shared your first experience with prior to the second actual hate crime? How did that conversation come about? How difficult was it for you?
If we're talking about the male rape, then it would be a therapist. And I can't for the life of me figure out how it went from one to the other. Maybe I do. There was, when they were checking me over the emergency room, and they checked me out, and it suddenly, it triggered a bit in my head, I guess, being touched in a specific area. So that could be when I finally got the therapy for the post-traumatic stress or the hate crime, that the rape came out. Yeah, I don't know exactly how, but it was the majority of whatever was talked about, because I think it more affected me even today than anything else. Welcome.
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you for sharing your story. And thank you, Analicia, for sharing us this very useful information. Thank you, everyone, for attending our event of Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And we hope to see you at our future events as well. Thank you. Have a great day.